Picture this: a NATO ally, a democratic territory, 57,000 people, and the President of the United States openly discussing military options to take it. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and this is not a hypothetical. It is not a rumor. It is not satire. The White House says acquiring Greenland is a national security priority. European leaders warn that such an act would mean the end of NATO. And in Greenland, ordinary people say they are terrified. This is not about ice or maps or real estate in the Arctic. It is about what happens when power begins to speak a language the world thought it had buried. If this story feels distant, it shouldn't. Because when rules bend for the strongest, they eventually break for everyone else. Stay with me. Share this if you believe global order still matters. To understand why Greenland is suddenly at the center of world politics, we must first ask a deeper question. What changed? So let's slow this down. Because the question is not whether the United States can acquire Greenland. The question is why this idea has returned openly, bluntly, and without apology. For decades, the rules were clear. Territory belonged to people. Borders were inviolable. Alliances mattered. Greenland complicates that story. It sits at the intersection of Arctic security, emerging trade routes, and global power competition. The White House calls it a national security priority. European leaders hear something else entirely, a challenge to sovereignty itself. This is where the tension lives. Between security and law, between strength and consent, between what power wants and what order requires. And this moment matters because it is not happening in isolation. It follows a pattern in which force is discussed casually, norms are treated as optional, and ambiguity becomes a strategy. Before we judge the outcome, we must understand the system producing it. To do that, we have to go back to the history, back to the Arctic, back to how Greenland became strategically indispensable. To understand why Greenland matters now, we have to step back, not years, but decades. During the Cold War, Greenland was quiet but critical, a vast landmass between North America and Europe, a listening post, a shield. The United States built a military base there not to conquer territory, but to defend a system. Denmark retained sovereignty. NATO held the line. Power operated within rules. But history doesn't freeze. It shifts with geography, technology, and climate. As Arctic ice melts, new shipping routes emerge. As global supply chains strain, rare earth minerals gain strategic weight. As Russia and China increase interest in the region, old assumptions weaken. Greenland moves from periphery to pivot. What once was a defensive outpost becomes a strategic prize, not because its people changed, but because the world did. And when the system feels pressure, great powers revisit old instincts. Control, access, dominance. That is the historical cycle we are entering. And once that cycle begins, it rarely stops at polite diplomacy. Which brings us to the first rupture, the moment when quiet strategy became open confrontation. The rupture did not come quietly. It came with words that were meant to sound routine, but landed like a shockwave. The White House confirmed the president was discussing a range of options to acquire Greenland, including the use of the military. For allies in Europe, this was not strategic ambiguity. It was a line crossed. Denmark's prime minister warned that any attack by the United States would spell the end of NATO. Within hours, 6 European allies publicly backed Denmark. They spoke of sovereignty, territorial integrity, the inviolability of borders. This was no longer a private negotiation. It was a public crisis. What made it explosive was not just the threat itself, but who it came from. NATO is built on a single promise. Allies do not threaten allies. And yet, here was the alliance's most powerful member doing exactly that. Stay with me. Because this moment was not an accident. It was a signal, and once signals are sent, They reshape behavior far beyond the Arctic. What matters next is not the outrage, it's the mechanism behind it. To understand this moment, we have to look past the statements and into the system beneath them. This is not about a single island. It is about how power now frames legitimacy. The White House language is deliberate. Greenland is described not as a partner or a people, but as a security priority. Once something is framed that way, extraordinary options become thinkable, even normal. Military force is not proposed as a plan. It is presented as a background condition, always available, always implied. This is how norms erode, not with tanks, but with tone. Add to this a second mechanism, precedent. The recent US intervention in Venezuela showed that force can be swift, targeted, and politically survivable at home. That lesson lingers. And when officials say nobody's going to fight the US over Greenland, they are not predicting war. They are betting on silence, on fear or fatigue, on the belief that rules only matter if someone enforces them. This is the machinery now in motion, and it leads directly to the next escalation. Then came the second shock. Not a speech, not a policy paper, a map. Greenland, colored like the American flag, one word stamped across it, soon. It was posted casually, but nothing about it was casual, because symbols travel faster than statements. And this one landed in Europe like a threat. Soon after, the message hardened. A senior White House aide said it was now the formal position of the US government that Greenland should be part of the United States. Asked whether force was off the table, the answer was telling, nobody's going to fight the US over the future of Greenland. That is not diplomacy. That is deterrence by assumption. At the same time, behind closed doors, officials spoke of buying the island or reshaping it through new political arrangements. Publicly, reassurance; privately, preparation. This dual-track approach creates maximum pressure with minimal accountability, and it leaves one group trapped in the middle. Not diplomats, not generals. The people who actually live there, which is where this story becomes personal. Now, let's talk about you. Imagine waking up to discover that powerful men are discussing your homeland as a strategic asset. Not asking, not consulting, just calculating. Greenland has 57,000 people. They vote, they debate, they argue about their future like any other society. And yet, many woke up hearing that their country might be taken. One young Inuit man said it was terrifying to hear the leader of the free world laugh about Greenland as if it was something to claim. He reminded us of something simple and profound. Kalaallit Nunaat means the land of the Greenlandic people. Not a buffer, not a bargaining chip, a home. And when you hear talk of military options, you don't think in doctrines. You think in fear, in uncertainty, in history repeating itself. This is where geopolitics stops being abstract. If this moment unsettles you, it should. Because the erosion of consent never stops at borders. Share this if you believe people matter more than power. And as emotions rise, the consequences spread outward. Beyond Greenland, beyond Denmark, to the world itself. What happens in Greenland does not stay in Greenland. Because this is a stress test not of territory, but of the global system itself. NATO is built on trust, on the assumption that power flows inward, not against its own members. When that assumption breaks, everything downstream destabilizes. European leaders understand this instinctively. That is why they moved quickly, issuing a joint statement, reaffirming sovereignty, invoking the UN Charter. They were not just defending Denmark, they were defending a rule. Borders cannot be redrawn by pressure alone. And beyond Europe, others are watching closely. Russia, China. If the strongest democracy treats territory as negotiable through force or coercion, the message travels. Not as rhetoric, as permission. This is how precedents are born, quietly, through normalization. The Arctic becomes more than a region. It becomes a signal about whose rules matter. And when what comes next will not be decided by maps or statements or even elections. It will be decided by choices. Which brings us to the future. So where does this lead? There are three paths forward. None of them are abstract. The first is the best case. Diplomacy prevails. The United States pulls back from coercive language. Greenland's future is discussed only with its people, and Denmark within international law. NATO absorbs the shock bruised but intact. Rules bend but do not break. The second path is more likely. Ambiguity becomes policy. No invasion, no resolution, just sustained pressure, political, economic, psychological. Greenland remains formally autonomous but permanently anxious. Allies adapt to uncertainty. Norms erode quietly. Then there is the worst case. Force is normalized, not necessarily used but accepted as legitimate leverage. Alliances hollow out, trust collapses, and the world slides into a system where might defines right, not because anyone chose chaos, but because no one stopped it. History tells us something important. Systems do not collapse suddenly. They thin, they fray, they are tested until one test goes too far. We are closer to that edge than we think, which leaves us with one final question. What do we do now? So let me leave you with this. Greenland is not the story. It is the mirror. It reflects a world where power is increasingly impatient with permission, where security is used to excuse coercion, and where rules survive only if they are defended even when it is uncomfortable. The danger is not that the United States will invade Greenland tomorrow. The danger is that the idea no longer sounds unthinkable. That is how orders end. Not with explosions, but with acceptance. For decades, global stability rested on a simple belief that the strongest nations would restrain themselves. That belief is now under pressure. What happens next depends on whether citizens, allies, and institutions still insist that power answer to principle, not the other way around. If this analysis helped you see the world more clearly, share it. If you want to understand where this system goes next, stay with me. Because Greenland is not the last test. It is just the one that made the quiet part audible. And the future will be decided by how seriously we listen.